So we're on the very first page of Maseches Eruvin today. We're beginning Maseches Eruvin. Those of you who have been with us for Maseches Shabbos should have some level of familiarity with the concepts that we're discussing in Maseches Eruvin, because it all revolves around the laws of Shabbos. Now, there's a Torah law that states that you're not allowed to carry in a Rishus Harabim on Shabbos for 4 amos. And if you do so, you've done a malacha. The definition of a Rishus Harabim is the subject of debate among some of the Rishonim. But what seems to come out is that it has to be an area that is traversed by a very large quantity of people every day. It's got to be a real public thoroughfare. According to some, you have to have 600,000 people traversing that thoroughfare on a daily basis. And furthermore, according to Rashi, it has to be an area that is 16 amos wide in order for it to be considered to be a public thoroughfare the way that it was in the Midbar. And accordingly, most streets in cities today are not considered to be a Rishus Harabim because they don't satisfy those criteria. However, large cities, there are certain arteries of large cities that do qualify the criteria of something being a Rishus Harabim, which creates more problems that are surmountable, but it just creates more techniques in order to be able to create an Eruv. But what we're talking about over here is the concept of a mavoi. A mavoi is what's called, we translate it as an alleyway, and it's basically, we talked before when we were learning Masechet Shabbos about the city engineering of most cities in the times of the Mishnah, was where you had Rishus Harabims as major arteries running through the town, and then homes did not abut a Rishus Harabim. You never had a house on Bathurst in the times of the Mishnah. You would have an entrance called a mavoi, which was a private little street, and in that private street you could have usually 2 or more courtyards, and in each courtyard there were 2 homes. And that was the way that people accessed their homes, was through the indirect traffic of going through the mavoi. And what we're going to be discussing is, how is it permissible for a person to carry in a mavoi? We have to realize a mavoi is by no stretch a Rishus Harabim. But the rabbis came along and said that even though something is not a Rishus Harabim, and really midioraisa it is permitted to carry, and really it is permitted to carry in a mavoi because it's not a Rishus Harabim, the rabbis forbid us from carrying into any domain which has a similarity to a Rishus Harabim, in the sense that it is not privately owned, but rather shared by multiple parties. And as a result, they told us that we're not allowed to carry unless we make some kind of remedy to incorporate the area and restore it to a single property instead of multiple properties. Okay? So that's the principle behind an Eruv. And also they told us to make some kind of recognizable sign upon entering into a mavoi, so that we'll remember the general principle that the whole basis of our being allowed to carry in this mavoi is because of the special accommodation that the Chachamim made to let us make an Eruv here. So there's a common misconception that people have, and that is that the Eruv is a loophole to circumvent a Torah prohibition. That's a gross misconception. It's a huge error that people make, but it's a common error that is made. It was made already in the 12th century. That's why Rabbi Yehuda Levi talks about it in the Kuzari. And he says that people make a common mistake, and they think that the whole accommodation of an Eruv is the rabbis figuring out a way to find a loophole around Torah law. Thank you so much. And that's not the case at all. The Eruv is not an accommodation for a Rishus Harabim. The Eruv is an accommodation for a domain which is only rabbinically prohibited. So the same rabbis who told me not to carry in this domain also said, except when you make this accommodation, to remind you of the law of Rishus Harabim. Okay, so that's the premise of this discussion of a mavoi. So mavoi shehu gavoa, or shehu lamaila me esrim ama yima'et. Rashi explains that we're going to see that one of the accommodations of allowing you to carry in a mavoi is by placing a crossbar over the entrance of the mavoi. Again, that's one of the reminders that you need to have upon entering into the mavoi. And if that crossbar is above 20 amos, because the doorway, the entranceway into the mavoi is higher than 20 amos, because the walls of that community go up higher than 20 walls, and so the entrance to the mavoi is higher than 20 walls, and therefore 20 amos, and you would normally put the crossbar over the top of the doorway, but since it's too high, you have to lower that crossbar. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eino Tzarech. Rabbi Yehuda says you don't have to. The harachav me'eser amos you might, and furthermore, the Tanna Kama says that if the doorway is wider than 10 amos, you have to minimize that doorway by putting some material, some solid material to block part of the doorway so that you make it smaller than 10 amos wide. And the im yesh l'tzuras pesach afal pishu rachav me'aser amos ein tzarech l'mayit. And finally, the Mishnah says, if, however, that doorway has what we call a tzuras pesach, has a door frame which is comprised of a crossbeam and 2 lintels, so then even if it's wider than 10 amos, you do not have to diminish the size of that aperture, because it has what's called the tzuras pesach, which is in itself enough of a recognizable symbol. So we're going to analyze all of these things very carefully. The Gemara now says, Tanan Hasa. We have a Mishnah in Masechah Sukkah which says, Sukkah shehi gavoa l'mayla me'esrim amma pesula v'Rebbe Yehuda machshir. That the same halacha that we have by a mavoi, we have by a sukkah. Just like by a mavoi, which we just learned, if the cross beam is higher than 20 amos, you have to lower it. So too, if a sukkah's height is higher than 20 amos, the sukkah is pasul. And there too, quite as we would have expected it, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees there too. Now, Maishna gabe sukkah the tani psula v'gabe mavoi tani takanta. So the Gemara's question is that why is it that in discussing the laws of sukkah, the Mishnah just says straight out it's pasul without offering an accommodation or a remedy of saying lower it, right? You could have used the same language by sukkah. If the sukkah is higher than 20 amos, then lower the schach. But it says no, stam pasul. But by a mavoi, we offer you an accommodation, a remedy. So the Gemara says, Sukkah d'oraisa toni psula, mavoi d'rabbanan toni takanta. Because Sukkah is a Torah law, it simply writes the word pasul, and because mavoi is a rabbinic law, it says what the remedy is. Now, one second, let me just explain the way Rashi explains it. Rashi explains as follows. When we're dealing with a Torah law, then the Mishnah is coming to address something that is already known to the Jewish people. It's telling me a halacha, that it's addressing a halacha that was already given to us by Moshe Rabbeinu. So presumably we know that the halacha is that if the sukkah is higher than a certain amount, then it's not kosher, and so therefore the Chachamim can come and tell us what is that measurement that makes the sukkah no longer kosher. Since they're addressing an already known halacha, they can say, if you didn't make it according to the way that Moshe Rabbeinu told to us, it's pasul, period. By contrast, a rabbinic law is not something that the Jewish people necessarily know about, because at the same time that the Mishnah is being composed or given to the populace, the rabbinic law is also being instituted. I mean, it could be several generations difference, but at least it's relatively new. So the rabbis can't come along and say that something is pasul if they haven't yet discussed the initial halacha. They have to first introduce us to the principle of what it means to accommodate carrying in a mavoi. So therefore, you can't tell me something's pasul without first telling me what the halacha is. So therefore, they have to first introduce the whole concept of creating a carryable mavoi, and they therefore tell us that in the event that you want to carry in the mavoi, there's a way to do it, but if the crossbeam is higher than 20 amos, then you have to lower it. So conceptually, the way Rashi explains it, it has to do with the pre-existence of a known halacha already versus a rabbinic law which is not already well known to everybody, and that's why you can't just say pasul to something that people don't even know is a halacha to begin with. That you're supposed to make an accommodation for a mavoi, and as a result, it has to tell you the remedy at the same time that it's telling you the halacha. That's one answer. Another answer that the Gemara gives is the ibayis ema, the oraisa nami tanita kanta, Ela sukkah de nefishin mile pasuk v'tani pesula, mavui de lo nefishin mile tani takanta. Second answer, says the Gemara, is that really even with Torah law, the Torah would offer, the Mishnah would sometimes offer a remedy. That's perfectly reasonable. The reason why a remedy is not offered by Sukkah is because it's the Tana's obligation to not only teach halacha, but also to teach halacha with the smallest amount of verbiage, because we have to be concise in order so that people will remember the text of the Mishnah. When it comes to the laws of Sukkah, there are a number of things that render the Sukkah puzzle, and if you want to fix the puzzle Sukkah, there are a number of different fixes for the puzzle Sukkah. It depends upon the psul, depends upon the thing that makes the Sukkah puzzle. For example, if the ceiling is too high, then you have to lower it. But there's another psul of a Sukkah. Let's say there's not enough walls, you only have 2 walls. So there's a different remedy for that. And there are a number of different remedies for puzzled situations in a Sukkah. And therefore, it would have taken the Mishnah in Sukkah much longer to describe each remedy for each kind of psul, and the Tana there felt he had an obligation to be concise over being more precise, and as a result, he just says, in all of those cases of where you don't meet the criteria, it's puzzle. And he doesn't go into each way to remedy each kind of psul. Whereas over here, where there's not much that makes, there aren't that many specifications of a kosher mavoi entrance, we can afford to tell you that if you didn't make it right, this is how you fix it. You just say you might. You lower the crossbeam, and then it's kosher. Okay, Bob, go ahead.
So, the question we're asking to begin with is about the sign, so you'll remember.
Yes.
That the Mishnah's not addressing that question. The Mishnah's just saying, by the way, it has to be lower or narrower, but it's not giving you a simon.
Correct. It's not detailing, at least at this stage, the purpose of the crossbeam, and it's not telling us make the crossbeam so that it'll be a recognizable sign that there's an accommodation being made here. That is correct. And the Mishnah speaks in that way. The Mishnah is very terse in its verbiage, and it assumes that you understand a lot of times certain background information, or that you're picking that up from the Rabbi who's teaching you the Mishnah. That's right. That's why it's called the oral tradition. Right. Amar of Yehuda Amar Rav, Chachamim lo lameduha ela mipischo shel heichal, v'Reb Yehuda lo lamedah ela mipischo shel ulam. So the Gemara says, what is the basis of this is Rab's halacha. Rab's statement is, where do the Chachamim get their halacha from? That the doorway, the entranceway to the mavoi can be no higher than 20 amos and no wider than 10 amos. They learn that from the exemplar of the doorway of the heichal. And Reb Yehuda, who says that it can be higher than 20 amos and wider than 10 amos, he learns it because he has a different exemplar, and that is the doorway of the ulam. Let's just understand these terms. In the Beis HaMikdash, even the Beis HaMikdash that King Solomon built, there were 2 doorways to the covered portions of the temple. There was the antechamber, which is known as the ulam, which was the first room that you walked into, and then you walked into a second room, which was the heichal, which contained the holy and the holy of holies. The doorway of the heichal was 20 by 20 in height, 10 by width, and the doorway of the ulam was 40 amos high and 20 amos wide, twice the size of the doorway to the heichal. The ulam was the antechamber, and the entire structure, looking at it from an aerial view, was in the shape of the letter T. And you would walk into the top of the T. The ulam was wide and short. In other words, it was a wide, short room, and then you would walk from there into the heichal, which was long and narrow. That was the bottom of the leg of the T. Okay? And so the doorways are 2 different sizes, and the Chachamim say the doorway of the heichal is the legitimate exemplar, and that's the only door that you can learn from. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, there's another door, the door of the heichal. So, Ditznan, as the Mishnah says, Pischo shel heichal gavo esrim ama v'rachvo esr amos, v'shalulam gavo arboim ama v'rachvo esrim amos. As I just detailed for you the measurements, as the Mishnah does. And they both feel that they're justified in learning their respective way from the same pasuk. The Torah says, "Ushchato Pesach Ol Moed," that you shall slaughter the korban at the entrance to the tent of meeting, which is the covered portion, another term for the heichal. The Rabbanan Sabri Kedushas Heichal Lechud Kedushas Ulam Lechud V'chi Ksiv Pesach Ol Moed HaHeichal Ksiv. The Chachamim are of the opinion that the antechamber, the ulam, has a lesser kedusha than the heichal itself, and therefore when the Torah says slaughter it at the entrance of the tent of meeting, it's the entrance of the heichal, because the heichal is the place which is has the heavy kedusha, and therefore the word Pesach in that pasuk is defined by the Pesach of the heichal. The Rabbi Yehuda savar heichal v'ulam kedusha echasi v'chiksiv Pesach ol moed atara v'ayuhu dichsiv. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the heichal and the ulam have the same level of kedusha. It's all one structure. So when you shecht, all you need to do is make sure you're at the doorway of the ulam, because the ulam has that same kedusha. And therefore, since that is the doorway that is crucial, that is addressed in the pasuk as being a Pesach, that is the definitional standard of what an entranceway is, and therefore, even if it's 40 by 20, it's perfectly fine. So the Ibai same. I'll give you another explanation. It's not that they both learn it from the same pasuk in Vayikra, but rather the Rabbi Yehuda nami kedusha sulam lechud kedusha seichel lechud v'hacha hainu timer the Rabbi Yehuda dichsiv el Pesach ulam habayis. That really Rabbi Yehuda, even if you hold that the ulam has a lesser kedusha than the heichal, but I have a pasuk in Yecheskel which talks about the third temple, and it talks about the doorway, the Pesach, that is by the ulam habayis, that is by the antechamber of the temple. So you see that the antechamber's doorway is called a Pesach. As long as I have a pasuk that addresses it as a Pesach, then I can use that as my definitional standard for a Pesach, for a Mavud. The Rabbanan's response to that is, Ihav aksiv el Pesach ulam kideka amart. Hashta diksiv el Pesach ulam habayis hapasuach leulam. But they say you're misinterpreting that pasuk in Yecheskel. That pasuk in Yecheskel is not talking about the doorway of the ulam. It's talking about the doorway that opens into the ulam. Because it's, as the pasuk says, it's the doorway of the antechamber of the house. So the word doorway is modifying the word house, not modifying the word ulam. It's the doorway of the house that opens up into the ulam, and therefore it's describing the door of the heichal, not the doorway of the ulam. So now the Gemara says, but let's go ask a more fundamental question. Let's go back to the pasuk of Ushchato Pesach Ohel Moed. You shall slaughter the animal at the doorway of the Ohel Moed. Now, Vaha Kiksiv Hai the Mishkan Ksiv. The Gemara says that pasuk is not talking about the Beis HaMikdash. There was no Beis HaMikdash when the Torah was written. What was there? A Mishkan. Right? Now, what was the height of the covered part of the Mishkan? The highest point of the Mishkan that was covered. How high was it?
We just learned it.
We just read it in the Torah.
Yeah.
It was 10 amos high. Eser amos orko, Eser amos rachlo, right? Eser amos, the orko, the length of each of the krashim was 10 amos high. Right? The highest point of the covered part of the Mishkan, of the heichal of the Mishkan, was 10 amos high. Half the height of the doorway of the heichal and a quarter of the height of the doorway of the ulam. So both according to the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda, how could you use that pasuk of Ushchato Pesach Ohel Moed to be your definitional standard to apply to the Beis HaMikdash if that pasuk's not talking about the Beis HaMikdash, it's talking about the doorway of the Mishkan. And the doorway of the Mishkan was only at maximally 10 amos high. So we should say, if anything, that the highest should be 10, not 20 or not 40. So the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you why. Because Ashkechan Mishkan de Ikri Mikdash, or Mikdash de Ikri Mishkan. Because no, we find that the terms are used interchangeably, that the Mishkan can be a reference to the Beis HaMikdash, and the word Mikdash is a reference to the Mishkan. And therefore, if we find the Torah uses the word Pesach vis-a-vis the Mishkan, we could also take that word which is written in the context of the Mishkan and use it to label a structure that existed in the Beis HaMikdash as well. And once we know that in the Beis HaMikdash that structure is called the doorway, we can use that to apply to Mavoi as well. And how do you know that? He says, De'ilo tema hachi, Hada Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Shalomim Sheshachtan Kodem Pesich Astelasos Ahechal Pesulin Shenemor Shchato Pesach Ol Moed, Bisman Shebesuchim, V'lo Bisman Shehem Ne'ulin. So he says, there's a famous halacha. The halacha is that when you shecht your karbanos in the courtyard of the temple, you have to make sure that the doors. Now, by the way, there were no doors, actual doors, that were hung in the Mishkan, but there were actual doors to the entrance of the Heichal. If those doors were closed at the time when you shechted karbanos, then the karban is pasul. How do I know that? Because the Torah says you shall slaughter it at the doorway or at the entranceway of the Ohel Moed. And you see from there that the word Pesach means an open frame, an open entranceway, because that's actually the word Petach is from the word Patuach, right? So it means that there's no door there, everything is open. So you see from the Mishkan that there has to be an open space where you shech the korban. V'haki ksiv hahi b'mishkan ksiv. And after all, that's written by the Mishkan. So where do you see from there that the door has to be open? There was no door. Maybe if there's a door, it could be closed. So rather, Ella Ashkechan Mikdash de Ikri Mishkan or Mishkan de Ikri Mikdash. But rather you see that what's good for that is good for that. Everything is interchangeable between the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan. Mishkan is called Mikdash, and Mikdash is called Mishkan. So whatever you see in one, if the Torah calls that by a certain name, in this case the word Petach, then that word Petach applies to the same corresponding structure in the Beis HaMikdash. And once I have a doorway that is 20 amos high in the Beis HaMikdash, then I know that it serves as the definitional standard for a Petach for a Mavoi as well. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. Bishlam Mikdash deikri Mishkan dichsiv in al-sati Mishkani v'sochechem ela Mishkan deikri Mikdash minolan. I can understand very well. I know that in the Torah, the Beis HaMikdash is called a Mishkan. Why? Because it says in Parshas Bechukosai, when God is blessing the Jewish people, He tells them that I will place my Mishkan in your midst. And there, like Rashi speaks out, the Mishkan has already been built. So how is God blessing the Jewish people by saying, I will in the future place my Mishkan in your midst? The Mishkan is already in their midst. So it must be referring to a future holy place which will exist in Yerushalayim, which is talking about the Beis HaMikdash, and yet the Torah still calls it a Mishkan. So that shows you that the word Mishkan can apply to the Beis HaMikdash. But Ela Mishkan Deikri Mikdash Minolan. But where do we ever see that the word Mikdash is used to apply to the Mishkan? So the Gemara says, Ilam imidichsiv b'nasuha ki hasim nosei hamikdash ve'ekimus mishkan es ha-mishkan ad boam. So the Gemara's first thinking is maybe we learn it out from Parshas Bamidbar, because it says over there that the Bnei Kahas, the certain family of Levium, who are in charge of transporting certain parts of the Mishkan, it says they shall establish the Mishkan upon their arrival. So it seems like the word Mikdash is a reference to the Mishkan. So the Gemara says, no. Hahu ba'arun ksiv. That pasuk is not talking about the entire edifice of the Mishkan. The reason why that pasuk is talking about that which the Bnei Kahas carry. In this case, they're carrying the Aram. They're carrying the Ark. Just the Ark is called Mikdash because of its sanctified status, because it houses the Luchos. It's the place of God's of Shechina. Right? So maybe that is called a Mikdash, but you don't see the totality of the edifice of a Mishkan is called a Mikdash from that pasuk. Ela mehacha ve'asu li Mikdash v'shochanti v'socham. But rather it's based on this pasuk in Parshas Truma, which we just read a couple of weeks ago, where the Torah says, they shall make for me a Mikdash, and I shall dwell in their midst. And that pasuk is talking about the Mishkan, which is the discussion at hand. I was a little bit bothered by this whole Shakla V'Tari in the Gemara, because the Gemara first jumps to a pasuk in Bamidbar as the first assumption as to a reference that the Mishkan is called the Mikdash, and it skips over Sefer Shmos, which is the main source text for the construction of the Mishkan. Why wouldn't you have first made an assumption to talk about Sefer Shmos, which comes first in the Torah, and is also the main place of discussing the construction of the Mishkan? So I think you may see certain ideas from the way this whole discussion is structured, but in any event, that's for another time. The Gemara now says, Bein l'Rabbanan u bein l'Rebbe Yehuda, lilfu mi Pesach shar hechotzer. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute. The assumption of our discussion has been all along that once you can find something in the Torah that is called a Pesach, then you can use that structure to tell you the dimensions, the maximal dimensions of the doorway of a mavli, right? So far, what we found is the word Heichal, or the word Pesach is applied to the entrance of the Heichal, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, it applies to the entrance of the Ula. But both according to the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda, I have another doorway which is called the Pesach in the Torah, and that's the entrance to the courtyard of the Mishkan. Now remember, the Mishkan has a covered portion, and then it has a much larger courtyard, and that courtyard has an entranceway. And that entranceway is also called a Pesach, and as we'll see, that entranceway's dimensions are even wider than the doorway that's described by either certainly by the Chachamim. So because it says Lilfu mi Pesach shara chatzer, Dichsiv orech chatzer me'ava ama v'rochav 50 b'50, dekama 5 amos. So first of all, what does the pasuk say about the courtyard? It says the dimensions of the courtyard are 50 amos wide, 100 amos in length, and the height of the curtains that would comprise the walls of the courtyard are going to be 5 amos high. Okay, that's the first statement. And uchasiv 15 ama kiloim lakasef, uchasiv lakasef ashnis mizeh u'mizeh l'shar chatzer kiloim 15 ama. So the Gemara says we know that the eastern side of the courtyard, which is where people entered into the courtyard, it says explicitly in the Torah that there were two wall flanks. You had an entrance, which was basically an open space where there was no curtains, and on each side of that entrance there was the two parts of the wall of the eastern side of the entrance of the courtyard. And the width of those two flanks was 15 amos each. Now, if the entire width of the entranceway is 50 amos, because we just told you that the dimensions are 50 by 100, the eastern entrance is entering in from the narrow side, and each flank is 15 amos on this side, 15 amos on this side. How much open space does that leave over? 20. Leaves over 20. You got a 50 amma wide courtyard side, right, which has curtains, but it's 15 amos of curtain here, 15 amos of curtain here. That's 30. So you have a 20 amma aperture that lets you come into the Mishkan. So I don't understand, why do you need to learn it from the doorway of the Heichal of the Ulam? Learn it from the entrance to the courtyard. And therefore the question is, Ma lahalin chamesh barochav esrim afkan chamesh barochav esrim. So the way that Rashi understands the question is that we're questioning why you need to learn about the width from anywhere else except from this source. The width over there is 20 amos, and then you have a perfectly legitimate source to tell you that the doorway of a mavoi can be certainly more than 10 amos. It could be 20 amos wide, and there should be no issue over here. So the Gemara answers, Pesach sha'ar hechatzer ikri, Pesach stama lo ikri. One answer, says the Gemara, is that doorway, that entranceway to the courtyard, is not called by the word petach generically, stam, right? It's called Pesach sha'ar hechatzer. It's called the entranceway to the gateway of the courtyard. And because it has so many modifying words to it, you cannot use as the exemplar of what the definition of a Pesach is. You can only use something as an exemplar of what the definition of a Pesach is if the Torah calls it simply Pesach. But if it calls it Pesach with other words to it, then that's not the definitional standard. The ibayis ema kiksiv kiloim 15 amalak osef bego vahahu dichsiv. So another answer, says the Gemara, is that really in reality you misinterpreted the pasuk. When the pasuk says 15 amos on either side of the doorway, it's not describing the width of the flank, it's describing the height of the flank. In reality, the curtains that formed the walls of the courtyard were 5 amos high, except on the eastern side. On the eastern side, they were 15 amos high. And that's what the Torah is describing. Not the width, but the height.
So how wide were they then?
The Torah doesn't tell us. That's the whole point. Exactly, Shlomi. The Torah doesn't tell us how wide the entranceway to the courtyard is. It just tells us that the flanks on either side of the doorway were 15 amos high.
According to this opinion.
According to this opinion. So the Gemara says, Go v'haksiv v'kama chamesh amos. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? The Torah explicitly says that it was 5 amos. The Gemara says, no. Hahu misafash mizbeach ulamayla. No. What the Torah means is simply that because in total there were 15 amos high, they were 5 amos above the mizbeach. Now the mizbeach's height was 10 amos at the top of the mizbeach in the courtyard of the temple. What would be the purpose of having one side of the courtyard very high when everywhere else was 5 amos wide? The purpose of it would be for tznius, for modesty. Because when the Kohen is on top of the Mizbeach, it's not derech eretz for him to be visible to the entire camp. You want there to be a certain intimacy when the Kohen is bringing a korban on top of the Mizbeach. So he's standing on a platform that's 10 amos high off the ground. You want to have some kind of partition where the public's going to be coming in to block their view of the Kohen offering the korban. And that's the rationale that on the eastern side of the entrance to the courtyard, the walls are much higher. And it says 15 amos high, which is 5 amos above the height of the Mizbeach, which is 10 amos high.
And he wouldn't be visible from the middle?
He might be visible from the middle, but that's not where most people would be standing. Most people would be standing from the east. Okay? So, Rabbi Yehuda, mipischo shel ulam gamar. So the Gemara now says, okay, this is a question. Rabbi Yehuda, mipischo shel ulam gamar. So now let's go back to our original premise. We have a machlokus between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim, according to Rav, learn it out from the definitional standard of the Heichal, and Rabbi Yehuda learns from the Ula. You mean, so is that really true? V'hatzanan v'harachav me'eser amos yema'et v'lo polig Rabbi Yehuda. The Mishnah had told us not only is there a requirement of a certain maximal height of the doorway, but there's also a definition of the maximal width of the doorway. And there we don't find that Rabbi Yehuda argues. The Tanakama says it can be no more than 10 amos wide, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't seem to argue. And according to what we were just telling, that he learns it out from the doorway of the Ulam, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it should be able to go up to 20 amos. So Amar Abaye Polig Bibraisa. You're right. He doesn't explicitly argue in our mission about the width, but he does in the Braisa. Titania Baharachav Miyud Amos Yemait, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eno Sarach Lemait. That the Braisa says that on this discussion of the width of the doorway, the Tanakama says 10 amos, and Rabbi Yehuda says no, it doesn't have to be 10 amos, it could be even wider than 10 amos. So frek the Gemara v'liflog b'mas nisin. So why then does he only argue in the Braisa? Let him argue in our Mishnah too. Answers the Gemara, Polig b'gova v'hu adin l'rachba. You're right, he does, but the author of our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, when he wanted to, sometimes for the sake of concisement, he sort of left off certain things that he felt were implicit. So this too is implicit. Just like he argues about the height of the doorway, he'll also argue about the width of the doorway. Frek the Gemara, ve'akoti Rabbi Yehuda mipischo shel ulam gamar. But still, how can you tell me that Rabbi Yehuda uses the ulam's dimensions as his exemplar? The Hatanya mavoi shehu gavoa michaf ama yemait Rabbi Yehuda machshir admem v'nun ama the Tani bar kapara admeya. So we have a brisa which is very bizarre. It says that according to the Tanakama, it can't be higher than 20 amos high. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, even if it's 40, even if it's 50, and according to Bar Kapara's version of Rabbi Yehuda, even if it's 100. So I can understand Rabbi Yehuda saying it could go up to 40 because that was the height of the Ulam. But where does he get 50? Where does Bar Kapara get 100 from? So the Gemara says, Bishlam le Bar Kapara guzma. I can understand if you wanted to say Bar Kapara was citing Rabbi Yehuda in exaggerative terminology. All he was saying is, it could be anything, it could be even 100, right? Not literally 100, but as long as he wanted to make sure you understood it could be more than 20, but he wasn't giving you a specific measurement. So therefore you can't really derive anything from Bar Kapara's statement. But Ela Rabbi Yehuda, my Guzma, Bishlam le Rabbi Yehuda, Arboim, Gamer Pischo Shalom, Ela Nun, Minale. But Rabbi Yehuda is not speaking in exaggerative terms, so I can understand where he gets it can be up to 40. But where does he get 50 from? So Amar Rav Chisda. So Rav Chisda says, Ha masnisa atiise l'Rav. Really, you're right. Based on that brisa that we just showed you, it's clear that Rabbi Yehuda cannot be using the doorway of the ulam as his exemplar, because if so, then the door could be no higher than 40 amos. And it's clear that Rabbi Yehuda permits the doorway even higher than 40 amos. So really Rav is mistaken. And what caused Rav to make his mistake? The following brisa. The Tanya Mavoi Shuhu Gavoa Michaf Ama Yosem Ipischo Shel Heichal Yemait. Because the brisa, in discussing the Shita of the Chachamim, says that if a doorway is higher than 20 amos, which is the measurements of the doorway of the Heichal, then it's too high, and you have to lower it. And who sover midrabanan mipischo shel Heichal gamri Rabbi Yehuda mipischo shel ulam gamar. And Rav made an assumption. He made an assumption that just like the brisa tells me that the Chachamim used the doorway of the Heichal as their exemplar, Rabbi Yehuda must have a different exemplar that was in the temple. So if it's not the door of the Heichal, it must be the doorway of the Ulam. So Velohi, Rabbi Yehuda mipischa de melochin gomar. And it's that, but that's actually false. The reality is that Rabbi Yehuda says you don't need to learn from the doorways that existed in the temple. The very fact that even to this day we have palaces of kings that are much larger than 20 amos high, but their doorways are much higher than 20 amos high. The very fact that those are called legitimate doorways means that a doorway of a mavoi can be higher than 20 amos high. There is no maximal dimension according to Rabbi Yehuda. As long as something conceptually is architecturally, from an engineering standpoint, can be considered to be a doorway, then it's a legitimate doorway. That's Rabbi Yehuda's shita. That to make a mavoi kosher, you need a doorway. And what's a doorway? Go out into the world. Go to China. Go to Babylonia. Go to Sumeria. Go to Rome. Go look at all the doorways that you can find in ancient palaces, and you'll see, as long as you can find a doorway that's higher than 20 amos, then your doorway can also be higher than 20 amos. So now the Gemara says, V'Rabbanan, imi pischo shel heichal gemiri, libo delasos keheichal. So now let's go back to the Chachamim. If the Chachamim are strict in their definitional standard, and they say you learn it out from the doorway of the heichal, well, the doorway of the heichal had an actual door to it also. So why don't we require a mavoi to have a door, just like the heichal entranceway had a door? That the most that we find that you need in order to make the entranceway of a mavoi a recognizable entrance is, according to Beis Shammai, you need both a lechi and a korah. A korah, as we mentioned, is the crossbar at the top of the doorway, and a lechi is a lintel or a sidebar at the side of the door. Beis Shammai say you need both this and this, and Beis Hillel say you need either this or this. But clearly neither of them require an actual door to be hung on the doorway. So the Gemara says, the answer is because according to the Chachamim, the door is not an integral part of the construction of the temple. It was there only to provide a sense of privacy, for a greater level of intimacy. But it's not an integral part of the doorway, of the entranceway, such that it's necessary. And afilu hachi eser amosu de raviach. But if that's the case, says the Gemara, if we're learning from our exemplar of the Heichal entranceway, so the Heichal entranceway had actually an actual door frame. It had a tzuras ha-pesach. It had two lintels and it had a crossbeam. And if that's the case, then anything that is wider than 10 amos or higher than 20 amos should not be kosher, even if it has a door frame. Then why? But why then does our Mishnah say that even if the doorway of the mavoi is wider than 10 amos, it can still be kosher as long as it has a door frame? But wait a minute, if your exemplar is the doorway of the heichal, so the heichal has a door frame, and it's still only called a doorway by virtue of the fact that it's 20 amos high and 10 amos wide, but not more than that. So how can the Mishnah say that it's kosher with the door frame even if it's wider than that? So the Gemara says, Midi hu taima el l'Rav. Hamasni le Rav Yehuda L'chia bar Rav Kamei de Rav, Eino tzarech l'mayit, v'amar le asnai tzarech l'mayit. So the Gemara answers, you have to remember, who is the Amora who says that the Chachamim use the exemplar of the doorway of the Heichal? That's Rav. Well, we have the following story with Rav. Once, one of Rav's Talmidim was reciting the Mishnah to him, and he quoted to him the Mishnah exactly as it appears in our text, which is that if the doorway to the Mavui is wider than 10 amos, as long as there's a door frame, it's still kosher. And Rav said, no. And Rav said, no, even if it has a door frame, you still have to diminish the size of the width in order for it to be kosher. So you see that Rav is consistent. Rav has a different version, he has a different girsa of our Mishnah, and in his version of the Mishnah, even if it has a doorway, you have to diminish it because his exemplar is the entranceway to the Heichal. And this is where we'll hold it for today.